Hello, my name is Scott Ramsay. I'm a behavioral ecologist in the Department of Biology at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about a mega fave number of mine, and that's the number 1,073,741,828. One of the courses I teach here at Laurier is a third year course in evolution. We get into all sorts of topics about evolutionary biology, trying to understand sort of the general principles of how populations evolve. Think about how the diversity that we see in the world around us today has come to be. And this can be traced all the way back to Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, where he in fact gave us two different big parts of understanding evolution. A mechanism, which is natural selection, and the idea of descent from common ancestry. This idea that we can look at living populations now and understand that they share common ancestry in the past. And Darwin depicted this second idea with the only figure that occurred in The Origin of Species. And that's this tree. And it's kind of an interesting thing, and I'm going to spend a second or two just kind of explaining about it because it will kind of help to inform a little bit more about where our number comes from. So if we look up at the very top of this figure, what we see is represented in Darwin's mind living species that we see now. And as we work down the figure, we go further and further back in time. And we can trace the living organisms that are alive now back to a couple of ancestral forms, as he would have referred to them. These would be species in our own modern way of phrasing things, back to a couple of specific ancestors. And so over on the left of the figure, we see that most of the lineages that are alive now trace their origins back to lineage A, back at the start of the figure. And over on the right, we see the living species that we see in those couple of groups trace their origins back to I. And what's implicit in this figure is that if we could trace further and further back in time, forms A through L would trace their own ancestry back to some common form that they all shared. Now, one of the things that you notice on here is that there are lots of lineages that leave no descendants whatsoever. So lineages B, C, and D, E, and F, for instance, have no descendants among the current species that are alive in this conception here. The descendants of B, in fact, die out before we even get to time tick 1 on this figure. E and F last a little bit longer. They have descendants that survive up until time tick 10. But there's lots and lots of extinction that has gone on, lineages that have failed to leave any kind of ancestors. So this is one way of thinking about how our contemporary biodiversity came about. But we can think about this in another way as well. And that's the idea that we can actually trace back in time histories of organisms. And we can do this for more than just organisms too. We can actually start tracing back the history of individual genes. So if we look at the genetic variation within populations, we can actually trace all of the gene copies in a population back to a single ancestral gene copy at some time in the past. And then if we look at related genes in other species, we can trace their gene copies and the copies in, say, humans, for instance, back to shared ancestral gene copy. And we can do this as well as looking at the species themselves. So we've got this kind of multi-level pattern of common ancestry. We've got it at the molecular level where we're looking at gene copies, knowing that they can have a pattern of descent that can be traced backwards to the ancestral forms of those genes, and the populations and the species themselves can do that as well. This idea that we can track genes back to an ancestral copy that is the kind of parent gene copy of all of the versions that are present now is what's referred to as coalescent theory. And in coalescent theory, what we're trying to do is figure out, what was perhaps the gene sequence like. And molecular geneticists who study the evolution of this have ways of working out patterns of mutation, figuring out what the likely version of a gene was at some time in the past. The other thing is trying to work out how long ago it was that we can find the ancestor of the gene copies that we find now. And if genes were just simply duplicated every time an individual produced gametes to make new offspring, that would be a fairly simple process. But it gets even more complicated because genes don't just make replicate copies that get passed on to offspring. Whole sections of genomes end up duplicated during evolution as well. And so we can end up with gene families that are composed of many copies of genes within a genome that themselves have their own evolutionary trajectory. So this gets to be a fairly complex kind of topic when you start really digging into it. And a nice way of trying to balance that complexity of what's going on at the gene level with sort of the big abstract thing that's happening with species is to kind of take it to a level that's a little bit closer to home. Lots of people like to kind of dig into their own personal ancestry. They will oftentimes have a family tree that somebody has maintained. There are all sorts of websites now that help people to do this kind of thing. And it's a bit of a, depending on where you're from, it may be one of those things that has always been a part of what is your family does. And in other places, it's something where you dig into it now and you're really unraveling mysteries that disappeared with your ancestors. And we can think about working out a family tree as being similar in some respects as working out coalescence. If we think about just one ancestral lineage, we know that at some point in the past you get back to a single individual who may have been your great to the nth grandmother, for example. If you follow back your mother's mother and her mother's mother and so on, we can actually go back to figure out, who was the mother of all of these people, your cousins, your aunts and uncles, your siblings, and really kind of get an idea that we can trace these things back to single ancestors. But at the same time, we have to think about the fact that with sexual reproduction, every time an individual reproduces, they are cutting their genome in half and mixing it together with the genome of half a genome of another individual. So we get these very complex genomes, and if we want to think about ancestry, we can think about how many ancestors do you have at a certain number of generations back, because that itself is going to tell you how many different variants of gene copies have come along to kind of reside then in the genome that you possess. And so one of the things I like to do with students is to sort of get them thinking about how many ancestors they would have at different stages back in their family tree. And this is fairly straightforward. If we think about at each generation, you've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and so on. You get this doubling every generation back. But how often do you think about how big the numbers get? Well, we can do that, and we can actually start thinking about what the numbers are. And this is where it gets really interesting, and we start to get into the number. Oops. So if you ask about how many ancestors you have a number of generations back, we can actually work this out mathematically. So if we want to think about how many ancestors you've got 3 generations back, it's 2 to the power of 3. And we get a value of 8. If you want to think about how many ancestors you've got 10 generations back, and this is one of my favorite questions to ask students, how many ancestors do you have about 10 generations back? And most of them just sit and shake their head and they can't quite figure out how they would get a grasp at that. But the answer is it's 2 to the 10. And 2 to the 10 is equal to 1024. Okay, well, once you've got that figured out, then all of a sudden it's a little bit easier to go back even further. So if we want to go back 20 generations, that's going to be this number squared, or 2 to the 20, or 1024 squared. And 2 to the 20 is equal to just over a million. It's 1,048,576. And if you go back about 20 generations, you're talking about 600, 700 years ago. That would be about the amount of time it would take to get back that far in human generations. But let's go back one step further. Let's go back another 10 generations, back 30 generations, and think about how many ancestors we would have then. And this is where we get to our number. 1,073,741,824. Now let's think about that. That's huge. And if you're, let's put it into scale. If you are somebody who plays around with computers, if you're familiar with the scaling of memory and processing power with computers, we talk about things like megabytes and gigabytes of storage, for example. And what we've got here, 2 to the 30, if we were talking about bytes of information, 2 to 30 bytes would be 1 gigabyte. So this is kind of the kind of scale we're looking at for the number of ancestors that a person would have if they went back 30 generations. And 30 generations is about 1,000 years ago. Now, this is kind of interesting, and I'm not the first one to talk about this. I've been talking about this idea and sort of using it with students for a number of years. You get sort of very big-eyed reactions from them because they haven't never really thought about what that means. And I'm going to take you a step further in a minute or two, but I do want to acknowledge that I'm not the first one recently to dig into this. One of the inspirations for this whole Mega Fave Numbers series, James Grime did a video on Numberphile in May 2019 where he actually talked about ancestry and ran through a nice little simulation where he talked about how you could figure out things like tracing back to a person who was the ancestor of all people, and kind of going through this, and he brings up the very same number. One of the things that he didn't do in this is actually, so he does go through a simulation figuring out how far back and kind of getting a concept of the point where you get to a stage where everyone is descended from a single person. Everyone alive now has a single common ancestor. And it's surprisingly recent. In the simulations he runs, it's back to about 700 or 800 AD. So we're not talking a long time. When we start doing that, when we think about that, there's an interesting thing to add on here. And this is one where I think students sort of end up with their eyes opened again as well. Not only thinking about how big that number is in terms of the number of ancestors you have, but also kind of where the number runs afoul of the reality of how many people were alive 1,000 years ago. So if we're assuming that 30 generations is about 1,000 years, and you've got well over 1 billion ancestors at that time, one of the questions is, how many people were actually alive in the world 1,000 years ago? And this chart kind of gives a nice trajectory of population for the last 1,500 years or so. And it's really interesting to look at sort of how this number goes. The population of humans in the world was fairly low and stable for a very long time. And we only hit 1 billion people as a living population on planet Earth shortly after 1800. If we trace ourselves back to the year 1000, around about when we're 30 generations back from all of us who are alive right now, it's quite clear there are nowhere near 1 billion people alive back then. And it looks like it's perhaps maybe about a third of the way there, maybe not. But we can actually think about what that population size is. And if we pull up estimates that people have published on this, what we see is that the estimates kind of hover around 300 million people. So we've got this interesting thing. You have about 1 billion ancestors at that stage, but there were only 300 million people alive. That means that there are, for every person alive back then, each one of them would be an ancestor of you at least 3 times. Okay, they're related to you through 3 different pathways getting to you in the present day. And that assumes that we're talking about a free mixing, randomly mating population of the world. And that's not the case. There may have been odd individuals every 10, 15, 20 years, once a generation, that move long distances around the world. But for the most part, movement between places was pretty small. And so if you know your family tree and you're aware that it only taps into a few places that are not very far apart, what it means is you're going to have, of those billion ancestors you've got 30 years ago, many of them are the same individuals over and over and over again. It would only be a situation where you've got somebody, ancestry that has come from various parts of the planet through migration, and now you are living in one place, but your ancestors have come from all sorts of different directions, where you may be hitting a good portion of the global population as your true ancestors. But even still, you have 1,000 times or 3 times more ancestors at that stage, at that generation, than there were people living. So that tells you that of the people who were alive then, there are some of them who left lots of offspring and are the parents of lots of lineages that are present now. And we know this happens all the time, that there are people who leave no offspring whatsoever. There will be people there that you are completely unrelated to. And so of the 300 million or so that were alive about 1,000 years ago, it's a small proportion that you're descended from, even though you numerically have about 1 billion ancestors that far back. And this is kind of an interesting thing. It makes a lot of students sort of wake up and kind of go, wow, that I hadn't thought about that before. One of the implications that you think about, so it means that genes that you have within you right now are descended from few copies at that stage. And that's interesting. So we can think about coalescence, but also we can think about genes as being descended from a few copies through inbreeding. Okay, and it's a bit of an ick factor for a lot of students thinking about inbreeding. The way we have cultural taboos that tell us that you should avoid that. But you don't have to go through many family trees, and you don't have to go very far back where you start finding connections on multiple parts of trees. And here what we've got is demonstration that by necessity, if you want to account for everyone you are descended from, there is inbreeding within the last 30 generations in your own family tree. And so genes that we find now are going to have arrived in your genome through recombination, kind of breaking up of genomes to make gametes, and the remixing of those genomes within zygotes, and then crossing over between chromosomes that mixes things up. Even the chromosomes that you inherit from two parents end up mixed and recombined in offspring that you have yourself. And so that means that we've got this idea of coalescence. If we want to start thinking at the level of populations of a species, that would be us, we don't have to go very far back before we can start finding ancestral copies of genes that we all share. And this is actually pretty cool stuff. This is how people who do evolutionary anthropology start figuring out, well, what were migration routes? Where do people trace their ancestry to? And how can we test for any kind of linkage between genetic ancestry and things like linguistic ancestry? Maybe there's connections, maybe there's not. And this allows us to answer a whole lot of really interesting questions about where we come from as people. One of the final thoughts to kind of leave you with, and I think this is a really interesting thing, if you take the time to watch the number file video with James Grime, which I'll link to in the description down below, he makes a really good point, and one of the papers he quotes from in that video is that we all share ancestors. We're all related to each other, and we don't have to go back that far to get to a stage where we all have ancestry in common. And this is a really cool thing. We don't know where those people were, where in the world they were, but we know they existed. We know that we're all descended from them, and it was not that long ago. Anyway, that's my story about my number. It's one of those things that it's valuable as a teaching aid. It kind of helps get a little bit of a message across and gets students thinking about the linkage of concepts and taking a little bit of a logical step and thinking about how big things can be, but also then the limitations on how you get to those numbers. And that's why 2 to the 30 is one of my mega fave numbers. Thank you.